Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville, and a longtime advocate, fan, and presenter of the arts and humanities. With me today on this week's episode of Kibbitzing with Kagan is a much loved and very well known and respected sculptor, Toby Mendez. Toby, thank you so much for taking out time from your schedule to chat today.
It's my pleasure, Cheryl, and thank you for that kind introduction.
Absolutely. So folks are going to get a sense of all of your extraordinary work, but we'd like to start with your background. You grew up in China, in Japan and Thailand. Why don't you tell us about your childhood, why that was, how long you were there, and what brought you to Maryland?
Sure. So I went to Okinawa when I was about 4 years old and lived there for about 4 years. 4 years, and then moved to Bangkok, Thailand, and lived there for 3 years. So spanning the years 1967 to 1974. And so my childhood experience, really, all my memories are from Asia.
Mm.
And I think that experience made me understand what diversity is and also what it's like to be the new kid and a kid that stuck out like a sore thumb, a little blonde kid in the middle of no one with blonde hair. So I don't know. I think it was very valuable to me as a person and made me, I think, a little more empathetic and understanding, a little more open.
That's great. Do you have siblings, and were either of your folks in the arts? How did you get started?
Yeah, I have, from the original family, I have an older sister and a brother who was younger. And then my father, after my mom passed, when I was much older, I have a brother, Jesse, who's just turned 30. So,
Wow. Okay.
yeah. And then my parents, my father was always an artist and always was creating, mostly paintings. And my mother was a decorator. And
Nice.
most people know my father from his role in the CIA. He was the subject of the movie Argo.
Right. Amazing movie.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Um, Anything more you want to say about your dad?
Oh, actually, about both of them is that there was always a creative environment growing up. They were always producing or creating something. You have to know our home and studios were all built by the family and also designed by the family.
Wow.
So we were always working on kind of what's the next idea and creating and producing, and always making money as entrepreneurs. So that was very inspiring as a child.
Fantastic. And what brought you to Maryland, and how old were you?
I was almost 11 years old, and my father got stationed in DC. And so we moved to Maryland. Maryland was my first home where there was, long-term stability. Really, I think of myself as a Marylander more than anything. I was born in Colorado, but have lived the majority of my life here.
Mhm. Great. Well, we're glad you do live here because you have brought such a wealth of beautiful art to Maryland. But we are going to get to that. Why sculpture? So, if your role models, your parents, were in interior design and painting, how did you navigate that your way there?
You know, I always was creating things according to my parents. When I was a child, I remember my mother doing a sculpture of me when I was about 6, and it just kind of stuck in my head. And when I moved back to the United States, still 10 years old, I started carving things. But I did drawing and painting. But sculpture always fascinated me. There were less people doing sculpture, and I just always loved the challenge.
And what's the breadth of the materials that you sculpted with?
I work with traditional materials, so mostly clay to either bronze. I've done marble carving, but mostly cast materials with some carving, and mostly the figure. I do some animals, but I'm known for my figures.
Yes. Has your style changed over the years? Or can people say, oh, that's a Toby Mendez piece?
I think it's been pretty much the same since I was in college.
Mhm.
I think it's become stronger with maturity, but I think there's a style there. I'm kind of oblivious to it, but people do recognize my work by the style.
Yes. You talked about diversity. You have talk about the diversity of the projects, the commissions that you've taken. And again, we're gonna talk in detail about some of those, but how
Sure.
important is that for diverse faces and figures to be sculpted?
Yeah, there's diversity in the subjects that I do, but also diversity in the types of projects that I do. I like to think of my work, if you were to look at it, as kind of like a character actor, but a leading character actor.
Mm,
Somebody kind of like a Christian Bale that could go in and out of different subjects and be comfortable.
mhm.
So if you look at the body of my work, you'll see the larger groupings would be civil rights, veterans memorials, sports
Oh,
work,
yes.
and then history, and then kind of the common working man, I would say,
Hmm.
with a lot of deviance from all of that.
That's pretty broad. Is
Yeah.
it different when you work for a government contract versus private, public versus private?
So, in some senses, the creative aspect of it, I just look at them as just different challenges. Um, with the private, a lot of times the funding is fully there, and there's not the red tape bureaucracy, but I'm used to both.
Mm,
I, my first large commission was done for a sculpture gardens, Embry Gardens in Calvert County.
mm.
And that was, it felt more like a private commission. Uh, Thurgood Marshall came shortly after that. And they were just two broad ends of the spectrum. One, there was more flexibility with the private contract client, but Thurgood Marshall is more specific.
You ever have trouble getting paid by public or private?
You know what? I probably conveniently forget about it.
Okay.
And I know my better half is in the other room, and she probably point out the times in their lives. I haven't had a problem. No.
So how competitive is it? There's someone who wants to have a sculpture put in their garden in a community garden or something. How do you hear about it? How competitive is the application process and the selection process?
It's very competitive. It tends to be the same 30 to 100 people applying for things. And then starting out in the beginning of your career, it's kind of like buying a home without having any credit, right? Track
Mm,
record.
mhm.
Somebody has to have take a leap of faith with you,
Yes.
and then the other projects that have kind of gone on from there, you have to adapt to the client, and I think the more successful artists are those that have a really good ear for the client, or are listening, paying attention to what their needs are. But it's very competitive.
I was once one of the judges for a sculpture in front of a courthouse in Rockville,
Oh,
and it was a wonderful experience and very collaborative and it's something,
which project was that?
the one in front of the red brick courthouse. It's a
So I competed for that.
did you?
I
It
was
was
on the short list for that. Yeah,
if I remember correctly, the artist was from New Mexico. And
that's right.
it's beautiful and I love it. I'm sure yours would have been beautiful too and very different from what was
Yeah, that one, I think there was a field of 10 sculptors on the short list, and they narrowed it down to a top three.
uh-huh.
And they actually asked me to come back because they did a public vote, and mine was got the public choice vote. And so I had a second round. But
Huh.
yeah,
It's been a long time now. Yeah, I'm not remembering all the details, but
sure.
so you apply, you get selected. Is it this is the vision, this is the rough draft and this is the way it's going to look, or is there modification that the client can ask or that you can offer?
I always tell the client that it's the beginning of an experience, right? That we're ideally all going down the same path together. But from the artist standpoint, I think the best advice to give an artist is don't assume that the selecting body could envision exactly what you're going to do. You can't be vague. You have to be very specific. But that said, I give a specific design, very highly rendered, but I make clear to the client that it's a conversation, that it's a back and forth, and that I'm willing to change.
Yes.
And I have had maybe 2 or 3 projects where the original presentation to them was completely different from like the second generation. But that was a dialogue. It was a collaborative back and forth with the client. What you don't want to do, I think, is you don't want to come in dug in, take it or leave it, because they leave it usually.
Right.
And the best advice my father gave me is to check your ego at the door. So, to come in as a listener.
That must be hard though, because sometimes what if the client wants something changed, then you just think they're, off in their opinion.
Well, I think the best thing you could do is to educate the client, to explain to them why you did what you did. Good example was the Maggie Walker for Richmond. And the subject of Maggie Walker, I was depicting her from around 1902, 1903, right around that period. And I came in and met with the Maggie Walker.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Tell us who Maggie Walker is, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maggie Walker is African-American. She's the first African-American woman to charter and become the president of a bank. And this happened in Richmond in about 1903.
Nice.
And she was a civil rights leader, and she wore many hats. Civil rights leader, bank owner, started the first African-American run department store, was a teacher, and many other things, a mother, entrepreneur, etc.
Amazing.
So what we did was I think I met with maybe 4 or 5 different stakeholder groups that had an interest in the project. And each one of them, I would present to them my design ideas. I didn't have a firm design, but that I was actually sharing. I did have a pretty good idea in mind. But I would show them things like, some of the images of Maggie Walker, she's wearing a hat. Sometimes she's wearing clothing that looks like she might be a domestic. Some, the ones that I liked is that she believed in bringing high fashion to Richmond. So I picked the high fashion. And so in presenting those ideas, I would explain to them, if she's wearing a hat, because of the shadow, you might not be able to see the face. Kind of bring them along to which direction I thought we should go, but also asking some very frank, honest questions of, if I did this, to make sure that I'm not stepping on any toes or hurting any feelings.
Yes.
To get that response, trying to get the truth from the client.
So from the beginning, you get the contract. Roughly how long? Give us an average length of time when it is done and presented, big reveal, big celebration of a new piece of sculpture.
Ideally, it's about a year. I've had some really large projects that I've done in 6 months. 4 months is probably the fastest, but usually it's typically about a year. The Thurgood Marshall took roughly a year to do. The only delay was the contract phase in the beginning. I started sculpting in January and had everything ready to install by October. And
you sculpt in your studio, not on site, correct?
That's right. That's right. All of that happens in my studio in Western Maryland.
Okay. So I want to share my screen and give folks a sense of the variety of sculptures that you've done here. And this is Toby's website. And So why don't you just talk so let's talk about the sports, folks, because we're seeing Eddie Murphy and there's Cal Ripkin and you have Earl Weaver. You're obviously a big Orioles fan and a proud Marylander. And you've also done a lot of important political figures like Thurgood Marshall and Teddy Roosevelt. And we're going to get to Thomas Kennedy and some of the others. But why don't you just talk as we're seeing the images go by?
Sure, that's the Thurgood Marshall that went by. You'll see in the beginning, that's Gandhi that I've done. And then the sports figures. For sports, I've worked with, most people know the Baltimore Orioles. I did the 6 Hall of Famers for Camden Yards. And I've also worked for the Boston Red Sox. I've done 5 different figures for them. The Miami Dolphins, I created the Don Shula that's in front of the stadium. And also I've done Nolan Ryan, which is in Arlington, Texas. And then some more that I'm very proud of. Major Taylor, who was the first African-American world champion in any sport. But Thurgood Marshall, Maggie Walker, Thomas Kennedy, Ernest Everett Just, and I think there's about a dozen, are all kind of in the category of civil rights or social justice.
So let's talk about Thurgood Marshall for a moment. So as folks, if you haven't seen it before, there is Lawyers Mall is what it's called. It's in front of the State House in Annapolis, and I walk by it every day on my way to the Senate chamber, and it is so inspiring. I actually share a birthday with Justice Marshall and have always been inspired by his story. And what I love is seeing not just legislators, but tourists, school groups, and protests are held right there in Lawyers Mall. There's a little sort of courtyard, and so in front of Justice Marshall, or just off from that area, is where teachers protest for better salaries, or environmentalists speak out for climate change. NRA members come and advocate for gun rights and all that. And so I just feel like Justice Marshall is looking down and observing democracy and freedom. So talk about that piece in particular, if you would.
That project was the third large public project I did, and I won it when I was about 31 years old.
Wow.
The project was put out as a national call. I think it was international. And they got hundreds of applications and narrowed it down to top 5 nationally. And I was the only Marylander in that top 5.
Did that matter, do you think?
It was funny because I thought I had, a 20% chance of winning. And somebody said, I think you have less of a chance than that. But when I heard about it, I was tracking it in the newspaper that they were going to put out that call. And so I was trying to figure out how to learn about this. This is pre-internet. So a couple of people contacted me and said, I saw something in the Post, or I saw something issued. You have to keep your ears open. And you probably remember Françoise Yohalam, because she worked on the project for Rockville. She was the public art coordinator. And they hired her to manage the competition. And I learned that the call was going to go out and that the artist would have maybe a month to research and less than that to design it. And I was so young and naive and so determined to be considered that I went ahead and read everything I could on Marshall. Nice. So I read Carl Rowan's book, and I read some other books. I mean, cover to cover within days. And then putting my application together, I realized I hadn't done any adult male portraits at that point. So within a week, I did a portrait bust of my father, photographed it, included it, and applied and made it into the top 5. And one thing I didn't say about my work is you'll see a lot of plazas in public settings, and I get very involved in the site design. Sometimes I'm designing the site, sometimes I'm collaboratively designing the site.
So that was actually a question I wanted to ask. So
Sure.
Justice Marshall is on a pedestal, and
Yeah.
there are columns behind him and equal justice under law. And then there are school children on a bench
That's right.
across from him. Did you do all of that?
That's right. That's right. So on the original design of the plaza, I asked Jim Urban, who's a landscape architect from Annapolis, to be my collaborative partner. I asked him before I applied because I knew the top 5 would be trying to find the best landscape architects in Annapolis, and he was the best. I said, Toby, get on the short list first, and then I'll consider it. I thought, no, I want to lock you in. So I did. I mean, I was really aggressive.
Good for you.
So you were talking about how that site is used.
Yeah.
It's a public gathering place to have your voice heard.
Yes.
And they didn't want Thurgood Marshall to necessarily be the backdrop visual looking at the State House if it was a protest that was something that Thurgood Marshall would not be happy about, like having the Klan there, which is
right.
happening. So if you think about the design, if you're on Route Boulevard,
So you rotated him?
Yeah, he's rotated. He's to the side.
Yeah.
And originally he was hidden a little bit by the trees. However, if you got in the plaza in the right angle and you did want him to be in the context, you could do that.
Yeah.
And then as you walk up on the side of Lawyers Mall, on the opposite side of legislative services, when you arrive at the steps that kind of enter into the plaza, you actually are at the same height as Thurgood Marshall. And because of the perspective, he looks life-size. And it looks like he's greeting you to come into the plaza.
Well, let me tell you 2 things. First off, the Legislative Services Building, which used to be behind Justice Marshall, has now been demolished and is being completely rebuilt. But if you're looking at Thurgood Marshall, standing looking at him, behind you is Government House, which is the governor's mansion and where our governor lives. And then to your right side, just for folks who aren't familiar with the location, to the right side is the Annapolis State Capitol, which is the oldest state capitol in the nation that has been in continuous operation. And so he is really kind of a linchpin in the middle of it all.
He really is.
So let's move on. I'm sorry, is it quick? Go ahead.
Yeah, so when you walk into the plaza and come down the stairs, he becomes heroic. And then the reason of the children and Donald Murray is those are the bookends of his history of overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. Right. So the bookends of his career.
Yep.
And
I want to talk about Thomas Kennedy briefly, because I think a lot of people have never heard of him. So why don't you talk super briefly, because I finally was able to get there and see it and took a bunch of pictures. So I went to Hagerstown to see some friends perform at a beautiful concert hall and made a point of finding the park. So that's a little pocket park with your wonderful sculpture. So who was this man and why does he deserve a sculpture?
Well, Thomas Kennedy was originally from Washington County, and he served as a delegate. And
that's what we call our house, our members of the House of Delegates. Some people call them state representatives. In Maryland, they're called delegates.
So as a delegate, he discovered that our state constitution did not respect religious freedom. That if you wanted to serve in public government as a delegate or senate, in the militia as an officer, or in public offices, you had to swear an oath to Christianity. And his background, real quick, he was actually, I believe, Presbyterian, and had, from my understanding, had never met somebody of the Jewish faith. But he saw that it was wrong, and he wanted to change it. And he ended up setting out to change this law, and he ended up losing his
He sponsored what was called the Jew Bill.
Exactly.
And then he was defeated as a result. Yes.
Exactly. And then he ran as a senator, got back in, and it took him like 7 or 8 years to do this. And so in the state of Maryland, our version of the Profile and Courage Award for somebody who
Yes.
serves in either, I think both delegate, as a delegate.
In the House. I think you have to be a
House.
delegate. Yeah.
Okay.
You get the Thomas Kennedy Award.
That's right.
Yeah,
And
it's a big deal. It's a huge honor. It's given once a year by the speaker.
yeah, and when I worked with Rabbi Plost on that project,
Yes.
he said that when he went to rabbinical school, they taught, and this was like in Ohio, they taught Thomas Kennedy.
Amazing. That's cool. That's
Right.
cool. So I've got a couple more questions, but actually we've covered a lot of them. Talk about sports. Talk about the Orioles Commission and what's different than working on political or historic figures.
Somebody once asked me the difference between a dedication of like Thurgood Marshall and a sports figure. Thurgood Marshall, you dress up in your finest, and the Morgan Choir comes and sings, and people are crying.
Right. And when it's Cal Ripkin or Eddie Murray.
Yeah, I'm still wearing a suit and tie because I have to, but you eat a hot dog and it's a lot more fun. So that's the fun in my career, is you get to have fun. With the Orioles, real quick, almost all of the Orioles that I sculpted, except for Frank Robinson, I saw play.
Nice.
And part of it is growing up in Maryland. It was the only place to go see a baseball game was at the Memorial Stadium. And so doing that project took me back to, my childhood, teenage years, and actually meeting those players that I remember growing up. And the same goes for working for the Red Sox. I met many of the same players that are playing in that era.
Nice.
And they were very fun.
That's awesome. Well, I was so glad to meet you for the first time at the dedication of at Bethesda Big Train.
Yes. Oh, yes. We met at the dedication of the Shirley Povich and Walter Johnson unveiling, which is a great crossover because there's a little bit of civil rights to that with Shirley Povich and baseball, and it kind of combines those two worlds, which is exceptional, I think.
And it's a beautiful piece.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Toby Mendez, what a treat it is to talk to you. It's time to go with our fast five quick questions to let folks know a little bit more about you. So question number one, what is your favorite sculpture that you did not do?
Oh, wow. Probably the work of St. Gaudens and Chester French. So Lincoln Memorial, mostly late 19th century works.
Okay. Question number two, Fantasyland. You could do any project you wanted in the world. What would you like to win the commission to sculpt?
Well, it's always meaningful projects. I really wanted to do Jackie Robinson and actually Sandy Koufax, and I was shortlisted for those. Martin Luther King. I've never done Martin Luther King. I've done so many others. Meaningful things, things that are universal, that mean something now and would mean something 100 years from now.
Let me ask you, this is a detour, but you've sculpted mostly men. Is it different for you, or is it harder to do women, or are women just not being sculpted?
Well, that's the new world that we're in. Is finally women are being honored, and so to me, again, meaningful projects. So boy, there's so much unexplored that we need to do.
The sculpture of Sojourner Truth and of Frederick Douglass in the Maryland State House just unveiled a few years ago. So fabulous. And you see how tiny she was and yet how powerful. It's amazing. Totally random. What is your favorite sport to play or watch, since you obviously are into baseball?
Probably baseball.
Okay. Did you ever used to play?
I was delusional and thought I would make the team and go into the major leagues, and because I grew up overseas, I didn't start playing any sports that we think of in the United States until I was about 11.
Got it.
So I was kind of impaired.
Okay. Late start. Sorry, say it again.
I did play football in high school, mostly the bench. So.
Question number 4, what hobby outside of the arts do you enjoy?
I used to play a lot of golf. I love music. I'm not musical. I don't play an instrument. I love great food, and I do like to cook from time to time.
Nice.
Um,
Great. And the last question, question number 5, the question I ask all of my guests. Toby Mendez, deeply admired sculptor, what is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have, something most folks can't do?
oh, I don't know. I really don't know. I think I'm doing what I love to be doing. So, and most people know about that, but I don't know the answer to that. So,
Oh, your wife is
in the
making
background, she said highly emotional IQ. I think I'm very intuitive. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty. That's a
You
good one.
can ask me what I'm working on now, and I can make it.
You know what? I did want to ask you that. Okay, tell us about Clara Barton and anything else you're working on.
Exactly. I'm working on 2 projects. Clara Barton that'll go in Hagerstown.
Yeah.
It's almost twice life-size figure with a Union soldier. And the other is Lefty Kreh, who is internationally known fly fisherman. Never heard of him. He's from Frederick, and he would fish with I don't know how many U.S. presidents and people like Ted Williams and so forth. And we're doing that right now for Frederick. And then I'm also working with some folks that want to recreate my Major Taylor Memorial that I did in Massachusetts, in Chicago. Just starting that. And then finally, we're just starting a project to do a sculpture of my coach from high school.
Oh, cool.
It's
That's
about
great.
mentorship and so forth. But
Still alive?
no, he passed a couple of years ago.
Okay. You know what? It occurs to me, talk to us about graffiti or have any of your pieces been has there been any sort of shenanigans or damage that's been done to any of your pieces?
Yeah, and you planned for that. So I had one spray painted. Unfortunately, it had been washed in wax, and the protective coating of wax means that if it was hit with spray paint, if you just take lacquer thinner, it takes the paint right off. Some of my sculptures have glasses, and I make glasses so that they could be replaced.
So Matty Stepanek in Rockville had glasses, and people are always removing his glasses, and he always needed his glasses.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, what a treat it has been to chat with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to kibitz. And thank you for what you do that really enhances the beauty of Maryland, but also educates people about our history, our culture, our diversity, and so much more. So we appreciate you. And I'm so glad we got to kibitz today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cheryl. It's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay well. See you soon.
You too.
Bye-bye.